Right. Welcome to the show today. I am delighted to have with us Professor Santosh Mehrotra, who is a senior development economist. He currently holds positions at the University of Bath and the Moscow School of Economics. Wait, I want to see if I got that right.
Higher school is
Higher
good.
school, higher, that's right. Thank you. Higher School of Economics at Moscow,
It's a research university.
and has previously held positions such as the chief economist at UNICEF, and also was a director general amongst the many positions he held in the Planning Commission of India. Santosh, your CV is way too long for me to elaborate on, but it is in the bio. And so please do have a look. And you have a new book out. So welcome to the show. And
Thanks very much
you're here
for
to talk
having me.
about many interesting things.
Right, right. We particularly, I guess, want to discuss the recent protests which went viral all across the country, and the young people, Gen Z, became uh, very, very excited and united in their opposition to the government's efforts to crack down upon them, as well as, more importantly, against the failures of on the employment side, as well as the failures of the education system, which they all perceive as being failures of governance. And they really protested across the country because of police action and police atrocities against them, because the police were actually using pellet guns and batons against them and beat up young people. Even girls were beaten up, all of which is extremely unfortunate. And the government was expected to apologize for that, which is what the Cockroach Janta Party, which was sort of leading the protest, was demanding, but there was no apology. But at the same time, the government has agreed that the education minister is to resign. So there we are.
So, just to give our listeners and viewers a little backdrop who may not be familiar with this, the Cockroach Janta Party was a satirical political party that was formed in May of this year. In fact, it's quite incredible how much they managed to achieve in such a short time. It was formed in response to an off the cuff remark by the Chief Justice of India, who, when talking about a case, imperiously talked about activists and young unemployed people as cockroaches. And this led to a moment on social media. Abhijit Dipke, that is their founder, who is a student in the United States, put up a post on X and then on Instagram. And I believe within the days, they had over 20 million followers. I want to just link this a little bit, Santosh. So this has been ongoing. It's in the news. The education minister has resigned. But to people not familiar with the backdrop for these protests, and it was essentially, what was the spark that lit the fire? Now, education, employment, accountability, all happening under the specter of fairly uh, authoritarian regime that suppresses protests. Let me stop
Right.
there and say you are very well placed to talk about both employment and education, both topics you've been working on for well over 20 years, and you just released a book on this. So let me pass this on to you.
So thank you for having me. Uh, Let me just say, Leela, that the authoritarian nature of the state is something that we have seen for the first time in the last 12 years. In the history of post-independence India, we've never seen a government which is as authoritarian. India still has been priding itself for decades as being the largest democracy in the world. and has successfully conducted very fair elections for, over a 75-year period. Unfortunately, recently, elections under this central government have become increasingly suspect. The government has become increasingly authoritarian and not accepting of much debate in parliament, not accepting of any criticism outside of parliament from ordinary citizens, calling people who criticize the government's actions, even if they are professional criticisms, as being anti-national, as though criticizing the party or the government in power is seen against the country as a whole, not just criticizing government policies. All of this is what is finally shown up in the young, essentially showing up in the streets in their millions and across the whole country. But the deeper problems, as you rightly hinted, are unfortunately the following. Those relate to a structural crisis in the economy, but the structural crisis is essentially displayed in a slowing of the growth rate of the Indian economy compared to a preceding 10-year period from 2004 to 14. And the growth rate slowing has meant that employment growth in the non-farm sector has not been as fast as we need to see happen, because we need nothing short of 12 to 13 million new jobs in the non-farm sector per annum. But, only half of those jobs are in fact being created. So you can imagine that larger and larger numbers of people are getting either unemployed or they are joining the category of those who can be called NEETs, or not in education, employment, or training. So they become discouraged workers. And now this crisis in the slowdown in the growth and the consequent reduction in the number of jobs is actually compounded by the problems arising from the education system. Unfortunately, fortunately, on the one hand, the higher education system has gotten massified too rapidly over the last 15 years. And we now have a gross enrollment ratio in tertiary education of about 29%. But unfortunately, a very significant share of this is in a private sector, which is pretty much unregulated. And this unregulated private sector is creating unemployables. So a lot of humanities or commerce courses being offered, and those young people may get certified, but they don't get jobs. Now, these two sets of problems, the employment in the economy and the education system, is compounded by a governance failure on the part of both state and central governments of the following kind. You see, as government jobs have not been growing, and particularly the private sector jobs have not been growing, the few government jobs that do exist, the young people who have to take exams to actually access those jobs, or those exams have not been conducted adequately with adequate transparency, and unfortunately, exam papers have gotten leaked, not once, not twice, but dozens of times. In fact, the data suggests that in the last 10 years alone, 152 exam paper leaks have taken place, which means that these students who work very hard to take, independent coaching, after doing their regular classes, they take independent coaching in order to be able to prepare and take these exams, because these exams are extremely competitive. There are far too many young people appearing for these exams, and too few places are on offer. So they are extremely competitive. So they have to undergo coaching, and the coaching is expensive. They are all run by private, colleges or private institutes over and above the private education that these youngsters are acquiring. So when the government machinery fails in actually even conducting exams fairly, then it causes a great deal of distress among the low middle class who are obviously very aspirational. Their demand for education has grown. Their demand for higher levels of living are growing, and their hope is that passing these exams will either fetch them a job or entrance into a medical college or an engineering college or of some quality. And if these exam papers get leaked, then all their effort gets wasted, and all the money that they've spent on the independent coaching and those private coaching institutions, gouge out a fair bit of costs from the parents, from the lower middle class parents and middle class parents, and it's very hard upon them. So in this context, when this last paper leak took place, the young just sort of had it. And unfortunately, 20 youngsters across the whole country who had taken the exam and found that their parents' savings had been lost, and the preparation efforts had come to naught, they committed suicide. 20 plus students committed suicide. Now, when that happens, obviously the whole country goes up in flames, and the young were extremely angry. And in this context, you brought out the statement by the Chief Justice of India, who very inconsiderately and very unkindly referred to these young people who might acquire degrees, but they may or may not be extremely employable. So he referred to such unemployed people as cockroaches, which is what triggered the creation of a meme by this student Deepke, who you mentioned, and this meme about the creation of a cockroach Janata Party actually got so many followers. It had 200 million plus followers. And it's not 20 million, Leela. It's actually 200 million plus. That's how big it is. When that really shook up the country for the following reason, because the young are all on social media. They all watch reels on Instagram. They create reels all the time, and they are very clever, many of them. And so the following grew and grew and grew. And when the young Deepke returned from USA, he started a protest in central Delhi, barely half a kilometer from Parliament, and that's what has resulted in this entire movement. Anyway, so which has gone on for about 1.5 months now.
Yes, thank you for pointing that out. I actually went to their Instagram page and they have 22 million, but I'm sure that it's far wider than that. And this protest has captivated the country and it's captivated the youth. Now, a couple of things I wanted to touch on. One is that, and people may not know this because India has been a country where it's been lauded as a fast-growing country, as a competitor to our neighbor China, and the next industrial powerhouse. And I wanted to touch upon an issue that you had brought on, that you had touched on earlier about unemployment.
Yes.
And give us just maybe a very broad taste, both about the structure of the Indian economy vis-a-vis its labor, and also some very top-line takeaways on why has employment been so stubborn, or should I say high unemployment?
Right. So as far as the structure of the employment structure or the labor market is concerned, let me just say that there's been a slow transition out of agriculture. A very high share of the workforce still is in agriculture. So by comparison, for instance, China has only about 25% of its workforce in agriculture, while India in 2019 had 42% of its workforce in agriculture. Unfortunately, post-COVID, the growth rate slowed even more in India, and the result of that was manufacturing, which was already slowing before COVID, absolutely collapsed, and more jobs were lost in manufacturing and in services and in construction. So millions of workers went back to agriculture. So the number of workers in agriculture actually shot up to 46% of the total workforce by 2024, which is very unfortunate. It is the opposite of what we want to see happen, while at the same time, the manufacturing contribution to gross value added has been declining. So, if there is one segment of the economy which has actually driven the growth, it is the services and the IT services exports in particular. And that's why the growth rate does appear to be as robust as it seems. But unfortunately, one in such a large economy with one of the largest workforces in the world, it clearly, depending upon services sector to drive growth, and that too a very highly skilled modern sector like IT services cannot generate the millions of jobs, as I said, the 12 to 13 million new non-farm jobs that we need. So that is the problem. So while the growth has been relatively, fast recovery, particularly out of COVID, and it does seem as though India might be the fastest growing large economy. That's partly only because China has slowed down. China has slowed down. And it should be mentioned briefly, if I might, here, that both China and India were at the same level of per capita income in the mid 1990s, and China then just took it, raced ahead, and its per capita income at purchasing power parity is actually nearly 2.5 to 3 times that of India today. And a very important foundational reason has to do with the growth of labor-intensive manufacturing in China. By contrast, in India, labor-intensive manufacturing did not generate the jobs, and that's part of the foundational economic problem that the country faces.
I also wanted to add, Santosh, to your discussion, to our discussion, that India is actually at the tail end now, or is it the tail end or in the middle of its demographic dividend, which means we have a very large number of young people entering the labor force. And people, I mean, this is an ongoing topic that people have talked about, dividend versus disaster. Just to get your top line thoughts on that.
Yes. So there seems to be an impression among policymakers and even journalists and academics in India, and maybe even the world, that India has a long way to go before its dividend ends, that it's a very young country. Actually, that is less and less so. Our dividend began in the early 1980s, and the dividend is very important because if we realize the dividend, we will ensure that as more and more young people join the labor force and get work outside of agriculture in industry and services which have higher productivity, then, savings will rise. Therefore, if savings rise, investment will rise, and that will raise the growth rate. That dynamic has partially been in place, but unfortunately now half of our workforce already is over 45. So in another 15 years, the dividend will be over. By 2040. Not only would the share of the elderly in the population be increasing very rapidly, but the number of working age entrants, those entering the working age, will begin to shrink in absolute terms. Currently, it is increasing. The working age share of the population is increasing, which is how the dividend is defined. but it's increasing at an accelerating pace. But that period will last for only 4 or 5 more years. In the next 10 years, from 2030 to 2040, the number of entrants into the working age population is going to increase at a decelerating pace. And by 2040, that share will begin to shrink. That means we will get to a point where China has already been in the last 10 years. So we have to beware, and it's critical that we have to grow much faster than we are growing and generate jobs for all these young people in the non-farm sector. So this is very important. This is the background and the context for the growing frustration even among the young.
Now, I want to I want to pose to you a few questions, because this podcast is just really, or this discussion is really an introduction to a much longer set of conversations that we're going to have on employment, education, accountability. What would you identify in both employment, education, accountability, and also, repression? Because what we're witnessing is state repression, because fixing employment, is not something that can happen in a few weeks or months. And so we're seeing a very repressive approach to squelching this dissent.
Right. So let me start with the governance, accountability, and repression set of issues that you raised. It's absolutely critical that the country will need a much more capable state in order to address the challenges of the economy, the employment sector, as well as the education sector. What do I mean by a capable state? A capable state is one which has persons who are knowledgeable about the domains in which they are operating, and we have a state which is large enough to actually intervene in ways that is required. Unfortunately, the size of India's bureaucracy is still way too small per 1,000 population. I mean, I do a comparison in the book about how many staff we have, and we're at the bottom of the league table. I won't go into numbers or detail just now. The bottom line is the size of the state has to grow, but even more importantly, the domain knowledge of the senior officers, the Indian Administrative Service, that has to improve. And the final thing that will actually ensure accountability, I believe, would be much greater decentralization of the government, and the states having much more powers, and the local bodies having much more powers as opposed to the center. Unfortunately, by contrast, what we have seen happen over the last 12 years of the existence of this government since it came to power in 2014 is a growing degree of centralization, and in fact, even worse, repressive actions, where an effort is made to weaken opposition parties, buy out opposition leaders and their members of the legislative assemblies or MPs. Now, all of this is completely contrary to democratic practice. It is happening on a scale which has never been seen before in our country. Electoral rolls are being manipulated by the ruling party in order to in order to cut out such voters who are likely to vote against this ruling right-wing Hindu leaning party, in order to actually win elections. So all of this has been happening, and police repression has been used. So all of this will have to be addressed, and none of this can be addressed unless changes in the law themselves happen. So that means none of this will actually happen without this government changing. And clearly, we need to have many more cleaner people in government, a capable state also implies that we don't have a situation where the number of members of parliament who have a criminal record according to their own affidavits submitted when they filed their candidature, which used to be 23% of all MPs had a criminal record in 2004. 20 years later, in the parliamentary elections of 2024, we have 46% of the MPs who have a criminal record, and several of them have very serious criminal charges against us. So these are all issues that have to be will have to be handled at some point if we are going to actually deliver on the economic challenges that I was referring to earlier.
I mean, there does seem to be a bit of a contradiction because young people have voted in droves for Mr. Modi.
Yes.
And they have, I mean,
I'll answer that. I will address that. So
you will. Okay, but we don't have to get into that today. But I'm saying that,
okay,
and they are now, I think there was a promise that was sold to them.
That's right.
That has not come to fruit. So that's a separate issue. That's a later issue for the next podcast. But I want to touch on a little bit for our listeners who may not understand this phrase, leaking of papers. This is not a new thing in India.
Yes.
And leaking of papers is essentially corruption where the final exam paper is released for money to certain people, right?
Correct.
Thereby gaming the system.
Absolutely. So some people attempt to game the system. Some examinees attempt to game the system. Now, how can they game the system unless the organization which conducts the exam, in other words, gets together the subject experts who will prepare the exam papers, put it together, and then the organization will then carry the physical copies of the exam papers across the length and breadth of this vast country. In that process, the papers working through a mafia or a group of organized criminals essentially would get copies of the original paper and sell it for a certain price to a few people who will then resell it to other people at smaller prices. And so there is a whole chain of organized crime criminals who benefit from this. But all this would happen at the expense of the 22 odd million young people who might be taking this entrance exam for the medical colleges of the country. So that's what leaking means.
And also, I just want to touch on the fact that 20 students have committed suicide, which is very serious, but there's also been a history of this. And the socioeconomic context of this is that, families sell land and sell jewelry and take out loans, at very usury rates to be able to put their children through this. And children feel encumbered by this immense pressure of poverty to even take the exam.
Correct. So the loans are taken for undertaking the coaching classes that I was referring to at the very beginning, because the school or the college does not prepare them for taking these exams, at least doesn't prepare them fully. So there's a whole trick to taking multiple choice question exam papers in the subject that they have to prepare for and clear if they're going to get through. So it's the coaching which becomes extremely expensive, and that's what, and children have to leave home and go to cities which have these coaching center concentrations. There are concentrations of coaching centers in our vast country in practically every state. So that's really the reason for the cost escalation on account of these exams. And then when you have a paper leak, then these children see their parents' savings having been lost and all their effort, also lost. And therefore they have to retake the exam. So all of this is very distressing for families as well as the children.
And goes back to the interplay of education and employment because of
Correct.
the short number of positions available. It's highly competitive. I think there's a joke where people will say, I stood for the IAS, which is the administrative service exam, did not get in, and so I decided to apply to Harvard and got in there.
Yeah,
It's a bit of a joke, but it's not a joke for the people who
definitely.
are actually working very hard, some very bright people. Just to wrap up our teaser,
Sure.
this is just a teaser of what's to come. Um,
Sure.
what are the five big demands of this cockroach party?
Oh, the first, so the first big demand, of course, was the resignation letter of the education minister. Because clearly the education minister has been in his job for years now, and he's presided over the 152 odd exam paper leaks. And because this national testing agency, which was created in 2022, and that's the ministry that oversees these types of exams. Clearly, the uh, the buck has to stop with the education minister. And the tragedy is that the government of India has for a whole decade taken this position that in our government people do not resign. Now that's a totally undemocratic approach, clearly, because if you are failing to perform your duty and you are repeatedly demonstrably failing to perform your duty, then it is incumbent upon you to take responsibility. So this goes back to the issue of accountability. So the young people were demanding that first the education minister resign, and the protest was withdrawn after 1.5 months, despite the fact that the government was refusing to, sack the minister. The government finally acceded. Secondly, their demand was that on the 20th of July, the police had brutally attacked them. So the second demand was that the government should take back all cases against them. So that was second big demand. The third big demand, of course, was that the prime minister should apologize to the nation for the fact that this has been going on, and at the same time, when they were peacefully protesting, they were attacked by the police. So finally, because the education minister resigned, and also the government did sort of first sort of half-heartedly acceded to the cases, legal cases being withdrawn against protesters, despite the fact that they had by and large been protesting peacefully. The CJP actually threatened that we will come, if you don't actually withdraw the cases, then we will resume the protest. So finally, today, the latest news is that today the government has actually withdrawn all cases from all protesters across the whole country, which is again very good news. So for the moment, there is peace, and there is a sort of quiet and lull, and all the young people have gone back home. However, you don't know when this might erupt again, for the simple reason that, as you and I have been discussing in this podcast, the employment issue and the economic growth issue hasn't gone away, and the crisis in the education system has not gone away. And therefore, the underlying issues will still have to be addressed by the government. And I'm certain that the young will be watching out with hawk eyes as we move forward in weeks and months to come.
Wonderful, Santosh. I'm so excited to carry this discussion on with you. And we haven't really touched on the book that you just published,
Right,
co-published.
right.
And we're going to get to that in the next episode of the series. So please stay tuned. We welcome Professor Mehrotra back to talk a little bit more about the interplay between education, employment, growth, and governance in India. And we are also watching the news about where the Cockroach Party goes forward. So thank you so much for being with us today, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you very much, Nina.
Okay. Hi, Santosh.
Yeah.